Today, I am delighted to share with you The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, a pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles in the clouds that pass forever flushing round a summer sky. Castle of Indolence. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun, as it broke the Sabbath stillness around, and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, often witnessing strange sights and hearing music and voices in the air. The entire neighborhood is rich with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot across the sky, and meteors blaze more frequently in this valley than in any other part of the country. The nightmare, with all her ninefold terrors, seems to favor this place for her mischievous pranks. The ruling spirit of this enchanted region, commanding all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a headless horseman. Some claim it is the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head was taken by a cannonball in an unknown battle during the Revolutionary War. The country folk often report seeing him rushing through the darkness of night, as if carried by the wind. His presence is not limited to the valley. He is sometimes seen along the nearby roads, particularly near a church not far away. In fact, according to the most reliable historians of the area, who have diligently gathered and compared accounts of this specter, it is believed that since the trooper's body was buried in the churchyard, his ghost rides forth each night in a desperate search for his lost head, galloping at an uncanny speed. Sometimes rushes through the hollow like a midnight gust, driven by the urgency to return to the churchyard before the break of dawn. Such is the essence of this legendary superstition, which has inspired countless eerie tales in that shadowy region. The apparition is well known at every country fireside, bearing the title of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is noteworthy that the inclination toward visions and fantasies is not exclusive to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously absorbed by anyone who dwells there for a time. No matter how alert and rational they were before arriving in that dreamy land, they inevitably fall under its enchanting spell, gradually becoming more imaginative, experiencing strange dreams, and even witnessing apparitions. I speak of this tranquil spot with the highest regard, for it is in such secluded Dutch valleys, nestled within the vast state of New York, that traditions, customs, and ways of life remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the sweeping tide of migration and progress, which brings ceaseless transformation to other restless parts of the country, passes them by unnoticed. These places are like small, still eddies along the edge of a rushing stream, where straws and bubbles drift serenely, undisturbed by the surging current. Though many years have passed since I wandered through the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, I wonder if I would still find the same trees standing and the same families flourishing within its quiet embrace. In this secluded corner of nature, in a distant chapter of American history, some 30 years ago to be precise, there lived a certain individual by the name of Ichabod Crane. He took up residence, or as he himself put it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of educating the local children. A native of Connecticut, a state renowned for supplying the Union with both intellectual pioneers and rugged frontiersmen, he belonged to that tradition of schoolmasters and woodsmen who ventured forth each year. The surname Crane suited him well, as his physique bore a striking resemblance to the bird. He was exceptionally tall and exceedingly lean, with sloping shoulders, elongated limbs, and hands that extended far beyond his sleeves. His feet, large and flat, might have served as shovels, while his entire frame appeared loosely assembled. His head was small and flat at the top, with oversized ears, large green, glassy eyes, and a long, pointed nose, giving him the appearance of a weather vane perched atop his thin neck, as if forever indicating the direction of the wind. Blue. To witness him striding along the crest of a hill on a blustery day, with his clothes billowing and flapping around him, one might easily mistake him for the very spirit of famine descending upon the earth, or perhaps a runaway scarecrow escaped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a modest structure, a single-room building crudely fashioned from logs. The windows were a patchwork, some sections glazed, others covered with pages from old copybooks. Ingeniously secured during off hours, the door was fastened with a twisted withe, while stakes propped against the window shutters ensured that although a thief might enter with ease, he would face considerable difficulty escaping. An architectural trick likely inspired by the design of an eel pot, courtesy of its builder, Joost van Houten. The schoolhouse stood in a secluded yet picturesque spot, nestled at the base of a wooded hill, with a brook murmuring nearby and a towering birch tree standing guard at one end. On drowsy summer afternoons, the low hum of pupils reciting their lessons could be heard, resembling the droning of a beehive, occasionally punctuated by the commanding voice of their master, issuing a stern warning or decree. At times, the hush would be broken by the dreaded swish of the birch rod, urging some reluctant scholar along the path of knowledge. To be fair, Ichabod Crane was a man of principle, steadfast in his adherence to the golden rule: spare the rod and spoil the child. His students undoubtedly were not spoiled. However, let it not be assumed that he was a tyrant who took pleasure in the suffering of his charges. On the contrary, he dispensed discipline with fairness rather than cruelty, shifting the burden from the frail to the sturdy. A frail, timid child who flinched at the mere sight of the rod might be spared, while the demands of justice were met by doubling the punishment upon some obstinate, thick-skinned Dutch lad who would glower, puff up, and grow sullen beneath the lash. To Ichabod, this was nothing less than fulfilling his duty to their parents, and no punishment was ever delivered without the reassurance, so comforting to the stinging recipient, that in time he would remember and appreciate it for the rest of his days. He had to live. When school hours ended, he often became the companion and playmate of the older boys, and on holiday afternoons he would escort some of the younger ones home, particularly if they had charming sisters or mothers known for their well-stocked cupboards. It was in his best interest to maintain good relations with his pupils. The income from his school was meager and would barely have sufficed for his daily sustenance, for though lanky, he possessed an appetite as expansive as an anaconda's. To supplement his livelihood, he followed the local custom of boarding with the families of his students. Each week, he resided in a different farmhouse, carrying all his worldly possessions wrapped in a cotton handkerchief as he made his rounds through the countryside. To ensure that his presence was not too burdensome on the finances of his rural hosts, who often regarded the cost of education as a heavy expense and schoolmasters as idle drones, he found various ways to make himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted in the lighter tasks around the farm, helping to gather hay, mend fences, water the horses, drive the cows in from pasture, and chop wood for the winter fires. Away from the schoolhouse, he set aside the strict authority with which he ruled his classroom and became remarkably mild and ingratiating. He won the favor of the mothers by doting on their children, especially the youngest ones. Like the noble lion that once gently cradled a lamb, he would sit with a child on one knee while rocking a cradle with his foot for hours at a time. Beyond his role as a teacher, he also served as the local singing master, earning extra income by instructing the youth in psalmody. It was a source of great pride for him, on Sundays, to take his place at the front of the church gallery, leading a choir of select singers. In his own mind, he far outshone the parson himself. Indeed, his voice rang out above the rest of the congregation, and even to this day, peculiar quavers can still be heard in that church, echoing faintly across the mill pond on a still Sunday morning, which, according to local legend, are the lingering descendants of Ichabod Crane's unmistakable nasal tones. Thus, through various small endeavors, employing that clever resourcefulness commonly known as by hook and by crook, the resourceful pedagogue managed to get by well enough and was generally thought, especially by those unfamiliar with the demands of intellectual labor, to lead an enviably easy life. In rural communities, the schoolmaster often holds a place of distinction within the female social sphere. He is regarded as a somewhat idle yet refined gentleman, possessing a taste and sophistication far superior to the rugged country lads and second only to the parson in learning. His presence at a farmhouse tea table frequently causes a mild stir, sometimes prompting the addition of an extra dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or even the rare display of a silver teapot. As a result, our scholar found himself particularly favored by the smiles of the local young women. He was in his element among them on Sundays, between church services, plucking grapes from the wild vines that drape the trees, entertaining them by reciting epitaphs from the old tombstones, or strolling along the mill pond with a whole group of admirers, while the bashful country lads lingered awkwardly in the background, envious of his effortless charm and poise. His semi-nomadic lifestyle also made him something of a traveling newspaper, delivering the latest local gossip from one household to the next, ensuring that his arrival was always met with enthusiasm. Moreover, the women esteemed him as a man of profound learning, for he had read several books in their entirety and was particularly well versed in Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, a work in which he placed the deepest and most unwavering belief. He was, in truth, a peculiar blend of keen shrewdness and naive credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his ability to absorb it without question were equally remarkable, and both had been heightened by his time in this enchanted region. No tale was too extravagant or grotesque for his boundless imagination. It was his frequent delight, after dismissing his school in the afternoon, to stretch himself upon the lush bed of clover that fringed the little brook murmuring beside his schoolhouse, and there pore over the grim narratives of old Mather until the encroaching twilight rendered the printed words a mere blur before his eyes. Then, as he made his way through swamp, stream, and shadowy woodland to the farmhouse where he was lodged for the week, every sound of the deepening night sent his fevered imagination into a flutter. The mournful call of the whip-poor-will from the hillside, the ominous croak of the tree-toad, a harbinger of storms, the eerie hoot of the screech owl, or the abrupt rustling in the underbrush as startled birds took flight, all conspired to unnerve him. The fireflies, glimmering brightest in the darkest recesses, would occasionally startle him when one of extraordinary brilliance streaked across his path. And if, by misfortune, a great clumsy beetle blundered into him on its erratic flight, the poor fellow was nearly convinced he had been struck by a witch's curse. His only recourse in such moments, either to stifle his own fearful thoughts or to ward off malevolent spirits, was to sing psalm tunes. The good folk of Sleepy Hollow, seated by their doorsteps on quiet evenings, were often struck with a sense of awe as they heard his nasal melodies, in linked sweetness long drawn out, drifting from a distant hillside or along the dimly lit road. Another source of his fearful pleasure was spending long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth. He would listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, haunted fields, haunted brooks, haunted bridges, and haunted houses, especially stories of the headless horseman, or the galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. In return, he would entertain them with anecdotes of witchcraft, dire omens, and eerie sights and sounds in the air that were common in early Connecticut. He would also frighten them with speculations on comets and shooting stars, and the alarming fact that the world truly turned round, meaning they were, for half the time, upside down. But if there was pleasure in all this, while snugly nestled in the chimney corner of a chamber bathed in a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, where, of course, no specter dared to appear, it was dearly paid for by the terrors of his walk homeward. What fearful shapes and shadows haunted his path amidst the dim, ghastly glare of a snowy night? With what longing did he watch every trembling ray of light streaming across the desolate fields from some distant window? How often was he startled by a snow-covered shrub that, like a ghostly figure, seemed to rise before him? How many times did he recoil in chilling fear at the sound of his own footsteps crunching the frosty ground, dreading to glance over his shoulder, lest he find some eerie being trailing close behind? And how often was he seized with utter dread by a sudden gust of wind howling through the trees, imagining it to be the galloping Hessian on one of his midnight rides? All these, however, were nothing more than the terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that roam in darkness. Though he had encountered many specters in his time, and had on more than one occasion been beset by Satan in various forms during his solitary wanderings, the light of day always dispelled these fears. He might have led a pleasant life, undisturbed by the devil and all his works, had his path not been crossed by a being more perplexing to mortal man than ghosts, goblins and witches combined, and that being was a woman. Among the group of musical disciples who gathered once a week to receive his instruction in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the only child of a prosperous Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of 18, as plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked like one of her father's peaches, and renowned not only for her beauty, but also for her considerable inheritance. She was, moreover, something of a coquette, as could be seen in her attire, a blend of old and new fashions, carefully chosen to enhance her charms. She adorned herself with pure yellow gold ornaments brought over by her great-great-grandmother from Saardam, a tempting stomacher of the olden days, and a teasingly short petticoat that revealed the prettiest foot and ankle in the countryside. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart when it came to the fairer sex, and it is no surprise that such a tempting prize quickly won his favor, especially after he paid a visit to her paternal home. Old Baltus Van Tassel was the very image of a prosperous, contented, and open-hearted farmer. True, his thoughts and gaze rarely strayed beyond the boundaries of his farm, but within them, everything was snug, happy, and well kept. He was satisfied with his wealth, yet not boastful of it, priding himself more on the hearty abundance of his lifestyle than on any show of grandeur. His homestead lay on the banks of the Hudson, nestled in one of those green, sheltered, and fertile nooks so beloved by Dutch farmers. A grand elm tree spread its broad branches over the house, shading a small well made from a barrel, where the purest and sweetest water bubbled up before trickling through the grass to a nearby brook that babbled along among alders and dwarf willows. Close by the farmhouse stood a vast barn, large enough to serve as a church, its windows and crevices brimming with the riches of the farm. From morning till night, the rhythmic beat of the flail echoed within, while swallows and martins fluttered and chirped around the eaves. On the barn roof, rows of pigeons basked in the sun, some with an eye turned skyward as if reading the weather, others tucking their heads under their wings or nestled in their bosoms, while still more puffed up, cooed, and bowed in elaborate courtship displays. In the pens, sleek and hefty pigs grunted in contentment, while their squealing piglets trotted out now and then, sniffing at the fresh air. A stately fleet of snowy geese glided across a nearby pond, escorting whole armadas of ducks, while regiments of turkeys gobbled through the yard, and guinea fowls scurried about, shrieking their peevish, fretful cries like ill-tempered housewives. Before the barn door, the proud rooster strutted, the very model of a husband, a warrior, and a gentleman, clapping his glossy wings and crowing with the joy and pride of his heart. Every so often he would scratch up the earth, then, in an act of gallant generosity, call his ever-hungry wives and chicks to share the choice morsel he had uncovered. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cosily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers, he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham. Not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure, a necklace of savory sausages. And even bright Chanticleer himself lay sprawling on his back, in a side dish, with uplifted claws, as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadow lands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit, which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children, mounted on the top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath. And he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare, with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. When he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was one of those spacious farmhouses, with high-ridged but lowly sloping roofs, built in the style handed down from the first Dutch settlers. The low projecting eaves forming a piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, various utensils of husbandry, and nets for fishing in the neighboring river. Benches were built along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel at one end and a churn at the other showed the various uses to which this important porch might be devoted. From this piazza the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion and the place of usual residence. Here rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. In another, a quantity of linsey woolsey just from the loom, ears of Indian corn, and strings of dried apples and peaches hung in gay festoons along the walls, mingled with the gaud of red peppers. And a door left ajar gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors. Andirons, with their accompanying shovel and tongues, glistened from their covert of asparagus tops. Mock oranges and conch shells decorated the mantelpiece. Strings of various colored birds' eggs were suspended above it. A great ostrich egg was hung from the center of the room, and a corner cupboard, knowingly left open, displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass, and walls of adamant to the castle keep where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved as easily as a man would carve his way to the center of a Christmas pie, and then the lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom van Brunt, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair, and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar. He was foremost at all races and cockfights, and, with the ascendancy which bodily strength always acquires in rustic life, was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles round. In cold weather, he was distinguished by a fur cap, surmounted with a flaunting fox's tail. And when the folks at a country gathering descried this well-known crest at a distance, whisking about among a squad of hard riders, they always stood by for a squall. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight, with whoop and halloo, like a troop of Don Cossacks. And the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Hey, there goes Brom Bones and his gang!" The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. And, when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire who felt no inclination to cross a lion in his amours, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's paling on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting, or as it is termed, sparking, within, all other suitors passed by in despair and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and, considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supple jack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke. And though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet, the moment it was away, jerk, he was as erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours, any more than that stormy lover, Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Balt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and, like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry. For, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house, or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Balt would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior who, armed with a sword in each hand, was most valiantly fighting the wind on the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable point or door of access, while others have 1,000 avenues and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but a still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with the redoubtable Brombones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare, and have settled their pretensions to the lady, according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knights errant of yore, by single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, in spite of its formidable fastenings of withe and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed a ferule, that scepter of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and whole legions of rampant little paper gamecocks. Apparently, there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a Negro in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-broken colt, which he managed with a rope by way of halter. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry-making or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's, and having delivered his message with that air of importance and effort at fine language, which a Negro is apt to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook, and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear, to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green in joy at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken looking-glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans van Ripper, and, thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipments of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, the choleric Van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal. For, old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand, like a scepter. And as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the hat. Gowns, homespun petticoats, and high-heeled shoes. The sons, in short, square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times. The daughters, almost universally pretty, with their long earrings, beaded necklaces, and snowy muslin frocks. Ichabod's arrival created no small stir among the assembled guests. His lank figure, his solemn countenance, and his exaggerated courtesy made him an object of curiosity and amusement. He mingled with the crowd, bowing with awkward grace to the ladies and nodding knowingly to the men. The music struck up, and the dance commenced. Ichabod, whose skill in dancing was second only to his singing, acquitted himself with great eclat. His loosely hung frame seemed to float rather than step, and he was soon the admiration of all present. In the midst of this festive scene, his eyes were continually seeking Katrina Van Tassel, the blooming beauty and heiress whose charms had captivated him. He hovered near her, engaging her in conversation whenever the opportunity arose. She, in turn, seemed not wholly indifferent, flashing him coquettish glances and responding with teasing laughter. However, lurking in the background was his formidable rival, Brombones, who observed the schoolmaster's attentions with a watchful and knowing eye. Though he made no direct move, there was a glint of mischief in his expression that hinted at trouble ahead. The evening wore on with feasting, merriment, and old Dutch tales spun by the elder farmers, while the younger folk indulged in dancing and laughter. Yet, despite the cheer, Ichabod felt a vague unease as he thought of the long, shadowy ride home through Sleepy Hollow, a place whispered to be haunted by spirits and specters. Little did he know, as he enjoyed the evening's delights, that fate had something far more chilling in store for him. Gallantly off. Ichabod, whose musical ear and nimble feet made him a distinguished figure in the dance, lost no time in leading Katrina Van Tassel to the floor. The schoolmaster, despite his lank and awkward frame, moved with surprising agility, his long limbs flitting about in time with the lively strains of the fiddle. His enthusiasm was infectious, and he beamed with pride as he imagined himself making a favorable impression upon the charming heiress. Meanwhile, Brombones stood by with an air of affected indifference, though his keen eyes never strayed far from Ichabod and Katrina. He exchanged knowing glances with his rough-riding companions, and now and then a sly grin played upon his lips as if he were plotting some mischief. The dance continued late into the evening, the guests reveling in the merriment of the occasion. Laughter rang through the hall, and the floorboards trembled under the lively steps of the dancers. But as the festivities reached their peak, Ichabod found himself drawn into a circle of seasoned farmers and matrons who, in hushed tones, began to recount the ghostly legends of Sleepy Hollow. Tales of strange apparitions and eerie encounters sent shivers through the gathering, but none was more chilling than the story of the Headless Horseman, the dreaded specter said to haunt the winding roads of the Hollow in search of his lost head. Ichabod listened intently, his imagination easily kindled by such macabre tales. The flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows across the room, adding to the eerie atmosphere. As the evening waned and the guests began to depart, Ichabod reluctantly prepared for his journey home. He cast one last hopeful glance at Katrina, but her expression was unreadable. With a deep sigh, he mounted his borrowed steed, Gunpowder, and set off into the night. Little did he know that his ride home would become the most fateful journey of his life. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion, clattering about the room, one might have thought St. Vitus himself, the blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before them in person. He was the admiration of all the Negroes, who, having gathered from the farm and neighborhood, of all ages and sizes, stood forming a pyramid of shining black faces at every door and window. They gazed with delight at the scene, rolling their white eyeballs and showing grinning rows of ivory from ear to ear. How could the flogger of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, smiling graciously in response to all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was drawn to a group of the Sager folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and recounting long stories about the war. This neighborhood, at the time of which I speak, was one of those highly favored places rich in chronicle and great men. The British and American lines had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding and was infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just enough time had elapsed to allow each storyteller to embellish his tale with a little becoming fiction, and, in the indistinctness of recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dofue Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman, who had nearly taken a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only for his gun to burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman, who shall be nameless, being too rich a mynheer to be lightly mentioned, who, in the Battle of White Plains, being an excellent master of defense, parried a musket ball with a small sword, insomuch that he absolutely felt it whiz around the blade and glance off at the hilt. In proof of which he was ready at any time to show the sword, with the hilt a little bent. There were several others who had been equally great in the field, not one of whom but was persuaded that he had played a considerable role in bringing the war to a happy conclusion. But all these were nothing compared to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that followed. The neighborhood was rich in legendary treasures of this kind. Local tales and superstitions flourished best in these sheltered, long-settled retreats, while they were trampled underfoot by the ever-shifting throng that made up the population of most country places. Besides, there was little encouragement for ghosts in most villages, for they scarcely had time to finish their first nap and turn in their graves before their surviving friends had moved away. So when they rose at night to walk their rounds, they found no acquaintances left to call upon. Perhaps this was why ghosts were so seldom heard of outside the long-established Dutch communities. The immediate cause, however, of the abundance of supernatural stories in these parts was undoubtedly the proximity of Sleepy Hollow. There was a contagion in the very air that drifted from that haunted region, an atmosphere of dreams and fancies that seemed to infect the land. Several residents of Sleepy Hollow were present at Van Tassel's, and as usual, they were sharing their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told of funeral processions, eerie wailing cries, and ghostly apparitions near the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre had been captured. Some spoke of the woman in white who haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, often heard shrieking on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. But the main subject of conversation was, as always, the most infamous specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman. Several people claim to have heard him patrolling the countryside in recent times, and it was said that he tethered his horse each night among the graves in the churchyard. The secluded location of the church seemed to make it a favored haunt for troubled spirits. It stood atop a small knoll, surrounded by locust trees and towering elms, its simple whitewashed walls shining modestly through the shadows, like Christian purity emerging from the depths of solitude. A gentle slope led down from it to a silver sheet of water, bordered by high trees that allowed glimpses of the blue hills of the Hudson beyond. To look upon its quiet, grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seemed to rest undisturbed, one might think that at least there, the dead could find peace. On one side of the church stretched a broad, wooded dell, through which a large brook rushed over broken rocks and fallen tree trunks. A wooden bridge had once spanned a particularly deep and dark section of the stream near the church. The road leading to it, along with the bridge itself, was heavily shaded by thick overhanging trees, casting an eerie gloom even in the daytime, but making it nearly pitch black at night. This was one of the favored haunts of the Headless Horseman, the very place where he was most often encountered. There was a tale of Old Brower, a notorious skeptic who scoffed at all ghostly legends, until the night he himself met the horseman returning from a ride through Sleepy Hollow. Brower was forced to mount behind him, and they galloped wildly through brush and bramble, over hills and swamps, until they reached the bridge. There, the horseman suddenly transformed into a skeleton, hurled old Brower into the brook, and vanished into the treetops with a resounding clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous adventure of Brombones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by this midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families in their wagons, and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains, and their light-hearted laughter, mingling with the clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter, until they gradually died away, and the late scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, I fear me must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth, after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women! These women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost, rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left to notice the scene of rural wealth, on which he had so often gloated, he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping, dreaming of mountains of corn and oats, and whole valleys of timothy and clover. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homewards, along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him, the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor under the land. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. But it was so vague and faint as only to give an idea of his distance from this faithful companion of man. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off from some farmhouse away among the hills. But it was like a dreaming sound in his ear. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was connected with the tragical story of the unfortunate André, who had been taken prisoner hard by and was universally known by the name of Major André's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights and doleful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood laid bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen, known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs, laid side by side, served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts, matted thick with wild grapevines, threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate André was captured, and under the covert of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy human concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream, and fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who has to pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a score of kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a stand just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?" He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no offer of molestation or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brombones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a stave. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then, they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over his horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow. But Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping up it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow, shaded by trees, for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge famous in goblin story, and just beyond swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskilled rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain, and had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to the earth, and he heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and unskilled rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, and sometimes jolted on the high ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hope that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the bosom of the brook told him that he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brombones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then, he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied that he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side. And now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, yet but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church, the saddle was found trampled in the dirt. The tracks of horses' hoofs, deeply dented in the road and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle which contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 stocks for the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, except for Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make a copy of verses in honor of the heiress of Van Tassel. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forth consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good to come of this same reading and writing. Whatever money the schoolmaster possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay but a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips gathered in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower, of Bones, and a whole budget of others were recalled, and after diligently considering them all, and comparing them with the circumstances of the present case, they shook their heads and concluded that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. Since he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, no one troubled themselves about him any further. The school was moved to another part of the hollow, and a new pedagogue took his place. It is true that an old farmer who had visited New York several years later, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought back news that Ichabod Crane was still alive. He reported that Ichabod had left the neighborhood partly out of fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly out of humiliation from being suddenly dismissed by the heiress. He had relocated to a distant part of the country, kept a school, studied law at the same time, was admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for newspapers, and finally had been appointed a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance triumphantly led the blooming Katrina to the altar, was always observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever Ichabod's story was mentioned. He would invariably burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he was willing to reveal. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of such affairs, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. It remains a favorite tale, often told around winter evening fires in the neighborhood. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, which may be the reason why the road has been altered in recent years to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The abandoned schoolhouse soon fell into decay and was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. More than one plowboy, loitering homeward on a still summer evening, has imagined hearing his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Postscript. Found in the handwriting of Mr. Knickerbocker. The preceding tale is presented almost exactly as I heard it recounted at a corporation meeting in the ancient city of Manhattan, where many of its wisest and most illustrious burghers were in attendance. The narrator was a pleasant, somewhat shabby yet gentlemanly old fellow, dressed in pepper and salt clothes, with a face marked by a melancholy humor. I strongly suspected he was poor. His efforts to be entertaining were so evident. When his story concluded, it was met with much laughter and approval, especially from 2 or 3 deputy aldermen who had slept through most of it. However, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman with heavy, overhanging eyebrows maintained a grave and somewhat severe expression throughout. Every so often, he folded his arms, inclined his head, and gazed at the floor, as if carefully turning a doubt over in his mind. He was one of those cautious men who never laugh without good reason, when they have both logic and law on their side. When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided and silence returned, he leaned one arm on the elbow of his chair, placed the other akimbo, and, with a slight but profoundly wise motion of the head and a furrowed brow, inquired what the moral of the story was and what it sought to prove. The storyteller, who had just lifted a glass of wine to his lips for refreshment after his exertions, paused momentarily, regarded his questioner with an air of infinite deference, and, slowly lowering the glass to the table, remarked that the story was intended most logically to prove that there is no situation in life without its advantages and pleasures, provided we are willing to take a joke as we find it. That, therefore, he who races against goblin troopers is likely to have a rough ride. Ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be denied the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step toward high preferment in the state. The cautious old gentleman furrowed his brows even more deeply upon hearing this explanation, clearly perplexed by the reasoning of the syllogism. Meanwhile, it seemed to me that the man in pepper and salt regarded him with a triumphant glint in his eye. After a moment, the old gentleman remarked that while all this was very well, he still found the story a little extravagant. There were 1 or 2 points about which he had his doubts. "Faith, sir," replied the storyteller, "as to that matter, I don't believe one half of it myself." Decant.